At 4:30 in the morning, a young woman walks out of an apartment building on a street she knows well. She is barefoot. She leaves behind her phone, her ID, her keys. A surveillance camera catches her for the last time at the corner of Woodlawn and 11th Street in Bloomington, Indiana. She is alone, she is walking, and then she is gone. That image, grainy, time-stamped, permanent, is all investigators have to anchor the final minutes of Lauren Spierer's documented life. Not a struggle caught on film. Not a witness who saw what came next. Just a young woman in the early morning dark, moving in a direction that leads nowhere anyone can follow. The timestamp reads 4:30 a.m. The frame lasts a few seconds, and then it ends the way the whole record ends, abruptly, without explanation, in the middle of a motion that was supposed to continue. To understand how that moment came to exist, you have to go back to the night before, and further back than that, to the city, the campus, the specific geography of a college town where thousands of students live stacked on top of each other in apartments the size of closets, where the distance between a party and a front door is measured in city blocks, and where the hours between midnight and sunrise carry a different set of rules than the rest of the day. Because the geography matters here. The layout of those streets, the positions of those buildings, the cameras that were and weren't running, all of it becomes evidence when a person disappears without a trace. The case of Lauren Spierer has no confirmed ending. It has no body, no confession, no definitive answer. What it has is a timeline riddled with gaps, a circle of young men who were among the last people to see her and who stopped cooperating with police, a family that refused to stop looking, and a legal battle that stretched nearly a decade past the night she disappeared. What it has is the particular dread of an open case, one where the answer exists somewhere, held by someone, and simply has never been spoken aloud. Bloomington, Indiana is a university town built almost entirely around Indiana University. The school enrolls roughly 40,000 students in a normal academic year, and its presence dominates the city the way a large institution always does. Its buildings set the skyline, its calendar sets the rhythm of commerce, its population defines what the streets look and sound like on any given evening. The neighborhoods directly west of campus, along Kirkwood Avenue and the blocks branching off it, are student territory in the most complete sense. Apartment buildings 3 and 4 stories tall sit shoulder to shoulder, their entryways separated by 4 or 5 feet of cracked sidewalk. Bars close at 3 in the morning. Pizza places stay open past midnight. The smell of fried food and spilled beer drifts out of open doors on warm nights, mixing with car exhaust and the particular green dampness that the creek corridors carry in from the west. On the sidewalks in warm weather, foot traffic continues until sunrise, and nobody thinks much about it, because this is what the neighborhood is for. Kirkwood Avenue itself is the spine of that social world, a stretch of maybe 8 blocks, lined with the kinds of establishments that define the college bar economy. Kilroy's Sports Bar, Nick's English Hut, which has been a campus institution since 1927, its wooden booths worn smooth by generations of students, the Bluebird, the Vid, the Crazy Horse. A Tuesday night looks like a weekend. A Thursday in June, even during the quieter summer session, draws the kind of crowd that requires waiting in line on a sidewalk that smells of cigarette smoke and warm asphalt. The streets feel safe because they are familiar and because they are populated. And that familiarity creates its own kind of risk, the risk of letting your guard down in a place you've navigated 100 times before, late at night, when the population that usually makes those streets feel safe has thinned out to nothing. In June of 2011, Lauren Spierer was 20 years old. She was a sophomore at Indiana University, a student from Edgemont, New York, which is a suburb in Westchester County, approximately 25 miles north of Manhattan, a quiet, wooded community of about 9,000 residents that sits at some distance, in every sense, from the kind of place Bloomington becomes after midnight. By the accounts of people who knew her, she was social and energetic, the kind of person who moved through a room and left it a little more animated than she'd found it. She had dark hair, a wide smile that showed up in photographs in a way that made her recognizable across a crowd. She stood 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed approximately 95 pounds, a detail that would carry investigative weight later when the question of what had happened to her physically became central to the reconstruction of that night. She lived in an apartment at Smallwood Plaza, Building C, on South Indiana Avenue, a few blocks from the heart of the student neighborhood, in a unit she shared with a roommate. She had a boyfriend named Jesse Wolfe, a fellow student who lived close by in a building on Woodlawn Avenue. She had a circle of friends embedded in the social fabric of the West Campus area. She was, by every external measure, exactly the kind of student who filled that part of Bloomington in the summer months. Young, connected, operating on the compressed social geography of a neighborhood where everyone seemed to know everyone else through 2 or 3 degrees of shared parties and mutual friends. She was also small. 95 pounds is a number that investigators return to when they consider what it would have taken to move her, to conceal her, to make her disappear from a neighborhood where people were still awake at 4 a.m. That is not a conclusion. It is a physical fact. It sits in the record of the case alongside every other physical fact, waiting for the context that has never arrived. On the evening of June 2nd, 2011, a Thursday warm and humid, the way early June in southern Indiana tends to be, Lauren went out. The night started the way most social nights in that neighborhood start, with a destination, a group, a loose plan that everyone understands will not survive contact with the actual evening. The place she started was Kilroy's Sports Bar on Kirkwood Avenue, a bar that functions as something close to the informal living room of Indiana University's social life. It is loud in the way bars with brick walls and low ceilings are loud, the sound bouncing back and forth until individual conversations blur into a single ambient roar. It is chronically overcrowded on a weeknight, and it has been a fixture of the Bloomington bar scene long enough that multiple generations of students have used it as a starting point and an ending point, and everything in between. Lauren was there with friends in the early evening. She drank. The night moved the way those nights move, from one location to another, through doors and back out again, carried along by the specific momentum of being 20 years old in a city whose entire infrastructure is oriented around your generation. The temperature in Bloomington on the evening of June 2nd hovered in the low 70s. It was early summer, the kind of night that makes the transition between bars and sidewalks feel like a pleasure rather than an inconvenience, warm enough to linger outside, cool enough to keep moving without breaking a sweat. The campus itself, 2 or 3 blocks east, was running on its summer rhythm. Quieter than the academic year, classes smaller, dormitories less than half full, but the off-campus neighborhood showing barely any reduction in its nighttime activity. The student apartments were occupied, the bars were open, the sidewalks were busy enough that a person walking at 3 in the morning would pass other people without comment. And then, at some point between 3 and 4:30, they wouldn't. At some point in the early hours of June 3rd, the sequence of events leading to that surveillance camera image begins to crystallize. According to accounts that would emerge over the following weeks, from initial police interviews, from the reconstructions that Lauren's family and their private investigators would eventually put together, and from the fragments of testimony that the civil litigation later produced, Lauren ended up at the apartment of a young man named Corey Rossman. His apartment was at 1810 North College Avenue, a building with a small parking lot out front and a buzzer entry that most residents of buildings like it learned to prop open for convenience. The address placed it within a few blocks of the commercial strip and within the same compressed geography as the other locations that would become relevant that night. Rossman, by the accounts available, was himself significantly intoxicated during this period. He later reported that at some point he fell and struck his head, hard enough that he required assistance getting to his building. A second young man, Jay Rosenbaum, who lived nearby in a complex called Whitehall Crossing on North College Avenue, was present during some portion of these hours as well. There was also a third figure in the orbit of that night, a man named Mike Beth, who had contact with Lauren during earlier portions of the evening. The accounts of exactly where Beth was during the final hours and what he knew about her condition during the transition between locations were among the questions that the civil litigation would later press hard on, and that would be met repeatedly with the same silence as everything else. The geography of what happened between roughly 2:30 and 4:30 in the morning is both the most important element of the case and the most frustrating. The distances involved are genuinely small. From Rossman's building on North College Avenue to Rosenbaum's building at Whitehall Crossing to Jesse Wolf's apartment on Woodlawn Avenue. The walks between these locations take between 4 and 8 minutes on foot at a normal pace. This is a neighborhood where the street grid is tight, the blocks are short, the street lights are the sodium vapor amber that turns everything the color of old photographs at night, and the landmarks are the same for everyone. Students navigate it without thinking, in any condition, at any hour. It is not a maze. It is not a place where someone could become genuinely lost without quickly finding a familiar landmark. The corner of Woodlawn and 10th is maybe a 6-minute walk from the corner of College and 17th. A person with functional legs and clear sight lines could cover the relevant geography in under 15 minutes. And yet, within that small geography, in that narrow window of time, something happened that no one who was present has ever fully explained. At 4:30 a.m., the camera at Woodlawn and 11th Street catches Lauren for the last time. The image is what surveillance footage from that era typically looks like. Not the high-definition clarity of modern systems, but the kind of grainy, slightly overexposed footage that comes from a fixed camera with a wide-angle lens mounted 8 feet off the ground, functional enough to confirm that the figure in the frame is the person investigators are looking for. She is walking west along 11th Street, away from the denser residential core of the student neighborhood and toward a less populated stretch. She is not wearing shoes. Her feet are on concrete that at 4:30 in the morning in early June would still hold some warmth from the day. She is alone. She does not appear to be in distress in any way that the camera captures. She is walking, not running, not staggering dramatically, not looking behind her. She is moving with purpose, in the way someone moves when they know where they are going. She is just walking, and then the frame ends, and she is gone, and that is the last frame. Lauren Spierer was reported missing by Jesse Wolfe on the morning of June 3rd, after she failed to return to his apartment on Woodlawn Avenue. The call to the Bloomington Police Department came within hours of that surveillance footage. By the standards of missing persons cases, an unusually prompt report, the kind that gives investigators their best theoretical chance of recovering someone who is still alive. Officers began canvassing within hours. By the end of that first day, what would become one of the most intensive and most prolonged missing persons investigations in Bloomington's history was already in motion. The search in the immediate aftermath was physical and systematic. Officers moved through the blocks surrounding Woodlawn and 11th, checking apartment buildings, commercial spaces, the green strips and drainage corridors that thread through that part of the city. Civilian volunteers joined within days, organized through social media posts that spread rapidly across the Indiana University student community, and then outward through the broader network of students' families and hometowns. Bloomington sits in a landscape that is, by the standards of the Indiana interior, unusually topographically varied. The campus itself is formally landscaped, with manicured quads and limestone buildings that give it a certain institutional solidity, but within a few blocks in any direction, the terrain becomes rougher and less managed. There are wooded corridors between developments, creek beds that run through ravines steep enough to make casual foot traffic difficult, and the limestone karst geology that characterizes south-central Indiana, a formation that creates, in some places, sinkholes and subsurface cavities not visible from the surface above. Jordan Creek runs through a wooded corridor west of the campus, its banks lined with brush and exposed limestone shelves, accessible from the street but not visible from it. Investigators familiar with the region noted, without drawing explicit conclusions, that the physical environment around Bloomington is one where a person or a body could potentially become concealed by natural processes in ways that would resist even systematic surface searching. In the first 72 hours, the search found nothing. Robert and Charlene Spierer arrived in Bloomington within 24 hours of their daughter's disappearance. They came from Westchester County, a 500-mile drive south and west, or a connecting flight through Chicago O'Hare and a rental car on I-65 to State Road 37 South into Monroe County. They established what amounted to a field operation out of a hotel near campus, the kind of corporate extended stay hotel that exists on the periphery of every mid-sized university town, designed for visiting parents and conference attendees and people with reasons to stay longer than a night, but not reasons to rent an apartment. Within the first week, they had retained private investigators to supplement the police inquiry, hiring a firm with experience in missing persons cases who began the work of reconstructing Lauren's movements from a different angle than the official investigation. Within the first month, they had hired attorneys. They organized additional searches, funding them personally and through donations that began coming in once the story reached the New York media market and Lauren's name became known beyond southern Indiana. They printed flyers, tens of thousands of them, bearing a photograph of Lauren taken before that night. Dark hair, that direct smile, the kind of image that becomes a fixed landmark in the public memory of a case once a face becomes permanently associated with a disappearance. Those flyers went up across Bloomington, across Monroe County, across Indiana. They eventually reached Florida, the Southwest, areas that the investigation's geographic logic hadn't necessarily suggested, but that the family's thoroughness and the unpredictable reach of a media story drove them to cover anyway. The Spierers spoke to press. They gave interviews to local television stations in Indiana and to outlets in the New York metropolitan area where their community knew them, where people recognized the name of the suburb they came from. They stood in front of cameras in the glare of portable lights set up on Kirkwood Avenue and outside the Bloomington Police Department, and they asked in terms that were controlled and clear, and evidently costing them something to keep that controlled, for anyone who knew anything about the night of June 2nd to come forward. They used the word please. They used it more than once. Robert Spierer, who had the bearing of someone accustomed to professional composure, kept his voice even in ways that made the evenness itself painful to observe. Charlene Spierer held her hands very still in front of her at the press conferences, as though keeping them still was a task that required her full attention. Within the first week, the investigative focus sharpened around the group of young men who had been with Lauren or near her during those final documented hours. Corey Rossman, Jay Rosenbaum, Mike Beth, all three were identified as persons of interest. All three spoke with police in the immediate days following June 3rd, providing initial accounts of what they knew and where they had been. And then, over the course of the following 2 to 3 weeks, each of them retained legal counsel and the conversations stopped. That sequence, initial cooperation, then silence behind the shield of legal representation, is entirely legal. It is constitutionally protected. Attorneys advise clients in exactly this situation to stop talking, and that advice is frequently sound, because the criminal justice system is structured in ways that can produce bad outcomes for people who speak candidly without counsel, regardless of what they actually know or did. Understanding that does not make the silence any easier to live with for the investigators on the other side of it, or for the family waiting in a hotel room in Bloomington for information that isn't coming. The Bloomington Police Department found itself holding the architecture of a timeline without the interior. They knew where Lauren had been at 4:30 a.m. They had the camera footage. They had her cell phone records, which showed that her phone, left behind in the apartment, had received calls that went unanswered starting at 4:38 a.m., 8 minutes after the last footage. They had the initial accounts from the young men, given before the lawyers arrived, which provided a partial picture of the night, but left the critical gap, the interval between the last confirmed sighting and whatever came after, unfilled. And now they had 3 subjects who were, on advice of counsel, no longer in the business of answering questions. Detective Kevin Smith was among those who worked the case in its early phase, part of a unit that spent the summer of 2011 running down every lead the tip line generated, revisiting the physical geography of the neighborhood, interviewing the wider social circle that Lauren and the men around her had moved through. The tip line, which the department publicized heavily, received hundreds of calls in the first weeks. The calls came from students who had been out that night and thought they might have seen someone matching Lauren's description. They came from residents of the blocks west of Woodlawn who had heard something or seen something or thought they remembered a detail that might matter. They came from across the country, from people who had seen the story on the news and were applying the particular kind of pattern recognition that makes civilians call in sightings of missing persons in cities 1,000 miles from where the person was last seen. Most of them were variations on the same fragments of information, reported by different people who had heard the same things through the same social networks. A smaller number were genuinely new leads, specific locations, specific observations, details that hadn't previously been part of the record. Investigators followed all of them. None of them led to Lauren. By September of 2011, 3 months after the disappearance, the Spierer family made a move that shifted the case into a new legal dimension. They filed a civil lawsuit against Corey Rossman, Jay Rosenbaum, and Mike Beth in Monroe Circuit Court. The suit was grounded in a theory of negligence, that the 3 men had had a duty of care toward Lauren given her condition during the hours in question, that they were aware of her level of intoxication and her physical vulnerability, and that they had failed in that duty in ways that contributed to whatever ultimately happened to her. The lawsuit was not a criminal proceeding. It could not result in imprisonment or a criminal record, but it came with a tool that the criminal investigation had been unable to deploy effectively against people exercising their right to silence: civil discovery. Civil discovery operates on a different set of rules than a criminal investigation. In a civil lawsuit, parties can compel the production of documents, text messages sent in the hours around the disappearance, emails, phone records, photographs stored on devices, and can require witnesses to provide sworn testimony in depositions under oath with a court reporter transcribing every word. The threshold for compelling that cooperation is lower than in a criminal proceeding, and the penalties for non-compliance are real. For the Spierer family, civil discovery represented the most viable remaining path to getting the people who knew something to say it under oath, where lying would carry consequences that casual silence didn't. The defendants hired attorneys. The attorneys filed motions. The litigation began its slow passage through the Indiana court system, through rounds of procedural argument, motions to dismiss, appeals of discovery orders, and counter motions that would consume years of calendar time and hundreds of billable hours on all sides. Every deposition was contested before it happened and contested again after. Every document request generated a counter motion arguing scope or relevance or privilege. The process moved at the pace that civil litigation in complex cases always moves, which is to say, slowly enough to feel, from the outside, like deliberate obstruction, even when it is simply the ordinary friction of the legal system doing exactly what the legal system does. In 2012, the case resurfaced in a way that commanded national attention. Corey Rossman, appearing for a deposition connected to the civil suit, invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. Not once, not a few times. According to reports from the proceeding, more than 100 times. Specific questions about where Lauren had been in his apartment, what her physical condition was, what had happened in the building, what had happened in the minutes after she left, each one met with the same constitutional refusal. The Fifth Amendment protects against compelled self-incrimination, and its invocation in a civil deposition is a legally distinct act from its use in a criminal proceeding. Under Indiana law, a civil jury is permitted to draw an adverse inference from a witness's repeated refusal to answer. It cannot be used as evidence in a separate criminal case, but it sits in the record of the civil proceeding. It sits in the deposition transcript, and it sits in the public memory of a case where a 20-year-old woman walked barefoot out of a doorway and never arrived anywhere. More than 100 invocations of that right in response to questions about a specific night is not a neutral image. By the following year, Jay Rosenbaum's deposition had added another layer to that record. He, too, invoked the Fifth Amendment extensively across a range of questions directly related to the night of June 2nd and the early hours of June 3rd. Portions of the deposition transcripts were reported by local and national media, including outlets in New York and Indiana that had followed the case from its first days. The picture those transcripts painted of specific, targeted questions about a missing young woman's last documented hours being met repeatedly and systematically with constitutional silence became the defining public image of the civil litigation phase of the case. It is important to be precise about what this does and does not mean. The Fifth Amendment is not a confession. It is exercised by innocent people on the advice of competent attorneys every day, in contexts where speaking openly would create legal exposure regardless of what the underlying truth actually is. The men who invoked it have not been charged with any crime in connection with Lauren's disappearance. There is no indictment, no arrest warrant, no criminal finding of any kind against them. What the invocations mean legally is exactly and only this. They chose, on advice of counsel, not to answer specific questions under oath. What they mean, practically, is that the civil litigation, like the criminal investigation before it, was not going to yield a confession or clear account of what happened after 4:30 a.m. on June 3, 2011. The searches continued in parallel with the legal proceedings. In 2013, 2 years after Lauren disappeared, the Spierer family funded additional ground searches of Monroe County, areas that had not been covered systematically in the initial weeks, identified through tips, investigative analysis, and the family's own study of the terrain west of campus. Teams used ground-penetrating radar in areas where the limestone geology made surface inspection unreliable. The equipment pulled over fields and creek banks in a grid pattern, looking for subsurface anomalies that might indicate disturbance. Cadaver dogs were brought in, animals trained to detect the specific chemical signatures that decomposition produces in soil, signatures that can persist for years in the right conditions even after surface evidence has long since vanished. The teams covered significant acreage across multiple days of fieldwork. They came back with nothing that advanced the investigation. Robert and Charlene Spierer stood at the corner of Woodlawn and 11th Street more than once during those years. They looked west, in the direction the camera had last recorded their daughter walking. They measured with their feet the distance she might have traveled in the minutes after that frame. 3 blocks, 5 blocks, 8 blocks if she kept moving. They looked at what was there in that direction. More apartment buildings first, then a stretch that opens into less residential terrain as the student neighborhood thins out, then a park, then Jordan Creek running through its wooded corridor. They looked at the limestone outcroppings at the creek's edge. They looked at the places where the trees closed over the path, and the nearest sidewalk ended, and the city's ambient orange glow didn't reach. They stood there in different seasons, in different years, in the specific suspended state that only families of the missing understand, knowing that the place where their child last stood is probably not the place where their child is, and not being able to stop standing in it anyway. In 2014, the civil litigation produced additional deposition testimony that added to the public record without resolving anything within it. The pattern held: questions framed around the specific geography of the night, Lauren's visible condition, the timing of movements between locations, what was seen and what was known, and the same constitutional refusals that had defined the earlier depositions. Rossman, Rosenbaum, and Beth had graduated from Indiana University by this point and moved on to other cities, and the ordinary progression of life that follows a completed undergraduate degree. Their legal representation continued. The deposition transcripts accumulated. The investigation file in Bloomington grew thicker with follow-ups and re-interviews, and forensic analyses that produced no new conclusions. In 2012, the Spierers established the Lauren Spierer Foundation, an organization built around personal safety awareness for college students, the specific kind of situational awareness that the circumstances of June 3rd made directly relevant. The foundation ran programming at universities, partnered with campus safety offices, and advocated for policies that might reduce the likelihood of other students finding themselves in the kind of exposed situation Lauren had been in during those final documented hours. It was, in one sense, a conversion, taking the grief of an unresolved case and forcing it into a form that could operate in the world, that could produce outcomes measurable in the number of students who heard a specific message about looking out for each other on a Thursday night in a college neighborhood. Robert and Charlene Spierer said in numerous interviews over the years, in the careful language of people who have learned to speak about unbearable things without breaking in public, that the foundation was not a substitute for answers. They said that clearly, and then they kept running it, because something had to be done with hands that couldn't stop reaching. The broader national attention to the case ran on its own particular cycle. The rhythm of a missing persons case that stays unresolved long enough to become a fixture of the news calendar. Each June, on the anniversary of the disappearance, media outlets produced update pieces. The Bloomington Herald-Times covered the anniversaries. National outlets revisited the story every few years when the civil litigation produced a new development. The Spierer family gave interviews year after year in which they said the same essential things. The investigation was still open, the family was still looking. Anyone with information should call the Bloomington Police Department tip line at 812-339-4477. True crime communities online maintained discussion threads that tracked every publicly available element of the timeline, cross-referenced deposition fragments reported in the press, and generated theories that ranged from carefully reasoned reconstructions of the available evidence to speculation that bore no relationship to documented fact. Occasionally, those discussions surfaced something specific enough that investigators were willing to follow up. None of it produced a breakthrough. In 2019, 8 years after Lauren disappeared, and 7 years after the civil lawsuit was filed, the litigation reached a settlement. The financial terms were not disclosed publicly, as is standard in civil settlements of this kind. The defendants did not admit wrongdoing, as is also standard. The Spierer family's attorneys released a statement confirming that the matter had been resolved. The defendants' attorneys released statements as well. And the litigation that had generated thousands of pages of depositions and motions, that had consumed years of time and significant sums of money on all sides, and that had placed the Fifth Amendment invocations of 3 young men into the public record, in a way that would attach to their names permanently, was formally concluded. It closed a legal chapter. It produced no account of what happened on the night of June 2nd, 2011. The case did not close with it. The Bloomington Police Department has never officially closed the investigation. Cold case detectives periodically review the file, which by now represents a decade and a half of accumulated tips, follow-up interviews, forensic analyses, documentary material, and the paper trail of a civil suit that consumed years of the American legal system's capacity. Lauren's DNA profile is maintained in the national databases that cross-reference missing persons against unidentified remains. The NCIC system that runs in the background of every open missing persons case, waiting for the day when remains found somewhere in the country produce a match that finally gives a name to an unknown. That day has not come. There is a detail about the physical environment of Bloomington that investigators and people familiar with the region return to without drawing explicit conclusions from it. The limestone karst geology of south-central Indiana creates a landscape that looks, on the surface, more uniform than it actually is. Monroe County sits on the edge of the Mitchell Plain, a karst formation where centuries of slightly acidic groundwater moving through soluble limestone have created a subsurface environment significantly more complex than the gentle wooded surface terrain suggests. Beneath the creek corridors and the fields and the hillsides west of campus, there are formations that don't appear on standard topographic maps: cavities, fissures, collapse features, subsurface drainage channels that have been shaped over millennia by water finding paths through rock. In the right conditions, a body introduced into such an environment could undergo processes of decomposition and natural dispersal that would make subsequent recovery difficult, even with the most sophisticated detection technology available. This is not a theory about what happened to Lauren Spierer. It is a geologic fact about the terrain that surrounds the last place she was seen, noted by people with relevant expertise, and it maps with cold and specific precision onto the problem of a search that covered years and found nothing. What the investigation produced across 15 years is this: a clear and documented account of Lauren Spierer's movements up to 4:30 a.m. on June 3, 2011. A group of individuals who were with her or near her during the critical hours, who provided initial accounts to police and then stopped. A physical environment that was searched extensively, repeatedly, using progressively more sophisticated methods, and that yielded nothing recoverable. A civil legal process that generated significant sworn testimony and produced no criminal charges. A family that has continued to function, publicly and privately, visibly and at significant personal cost, in the specific way that families of the missing are forced to function, holding the possibility of both outcomes simultaneously, because closing off either one requires certainty that has never arrived. Lauren Spierer would be 34 years old now. She grew up 25 miles north of Manhattan, in a suburb with good schools and tree-lined streets, and the particular texture of a childhood that was never supposed to end the way this one apparently did. She went to Indiana University to study communications. She had a social life, a boyfriend, a circle of friends, a building she lived in, and a neighborhood she knew, and a Thursday night that began the way thousands of Thursday nights begin in that neighborhood, for thousands of students who go out and come home without incident. She left an apartment building at 4:30 in the morning without her shoes and without her phone, and she walked west on 11th Street, and the camera recorded it, and then the recording ended. The corner of Woodlawn and 11th Street still exists. The apartment buildings are still there. The bars on Kirkwood Avenue are still open late, still full of students who have no particular memory of 2011, who were 10 or 11 years old when Lauren walked past that camera for the last time, who are now the same age she was that night, and who navigate the same 6-block radius on the same late Thursday evenings without the memory of what happened in it. The campus runs on its familiar rhythm. The summer sessions come and go. The limestone runs beneath it all, quiet and full of cavities, shaped by water and time in ways that don't show up on any map. Whatever happened in the space between that camera frame and whatever came after, in the geography of those few blocks on the west side of a college town in southern Indiana, in the time between those last documented minutes and whatever minute that night became its own permanent endpoint, in the silence that has been maintained by people who were present and who have remained in that silence for 15 years, has never been said out loud by anyone who knows. The investigation is still open. The file sits in a cabinet in Bloomington and in the digital systems of the national databases. It waits for a tip that hasn't come, for a match that hasn't returned, for someone to decide that 15 years of silence is long enough. If this case stayed with you, the particular weight of a disappearance, where the geography is small and the silence is deliberate and the answers are held somewhere and simply not spoken, there is another investigation on this channel that ran along a similar edge for over a decade. The trail kept going cold in all the wrong places. That one is waiting for you next.